Brooks River is a cornucopia of plenty. It's probably the first place in Katmai National Park where salmon are available to brown bears. And in late summer and fall, it's among the very last places where bears can forage for fish. However, opportunities to catch salmon isn't guaranteed. The most productive fishing spots are well sought after by many bears, so this place has a setting that seems ripe for competition and conflict. And we're seeing a lot of that on the river this year. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. Joining me today is my co-host, Naomi Boak, a park ranger at Katmai National Park. We're standing near the mouth of Brooks River. Right behind us, Dumpling Mountain in the background. A beautiful scene today, but we're going to talk about the bear hierarchy and how bears fit into a system of hierarchy and how that helps them to survive in a very competitive environment, Naomi. And I think perhaps to begin, it would be great to consider maybe a dictionary definition of like dominance, for example, and consider how that fits into the bear's world.
Well, I mean, might think of dominance as having power and influence over someone or something else. And that's true in the bear world, but it's not just about that. It's about surviving and thriving. It's not about showing off. And bears need to have this, especially in a place like the Brooks River, where there is competition for all kinds of resources. And hierarchy is also protection from injury, because if a bear is injured here, that could put him out of commission for job one, which is eating and getting fat. And it also means for sows with cubs, if they know their position in the hierarchy or they have a higher position, a more dominant position, it means safety for their cubs. 747, 856 have kind of switched positions this year in dominance hierarchy. Top is usually the boars, and 856 has been our top dog, so to speak, and most dominant bear, most influential bear for 10 years. But this year we see 747 challenging 856. And what's interesting, though, we haven't seen any fights between the two of them. They're creating this dominance hierarchy without injury, and part of that is just to avoid injury so that they can have access to the best fishing spots, the females that they want. And is it worth all that? And so bears are weighing and balancing risk and reward all the time when it comes to dominance, that influence and power over other bears, because what they want to do is eat more, move less, to be able to thrive during this season and to reproduce. So that's all part of the base of creating a hierarchy. And those who are at the top of the hierarchy are going to have a better ability to do so. So what characteristics really define rank in the bear world here at Brooks River?
Yeah, I mean, bears are looking to establish advantage over other bears when we're thinking about the system of dominance and hierarchy. And in the bear world, really the thing that probably matters most in establishing your rank within the hierarchy is body size overall. So that's why almost always you'll see the largest adult males at the river at the top of the hierarchy. And to be clear for everybody, if you're not really maybe familiar with the system of hierarchy at Brooks River, there's not like an alpha and a beta and blah, 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 and so forth. It's a very sort of fluid system overall. But yeah, the biggest bears are going to rank at the top most consistently. You just got a glimpse there of 856. We're going to throw up a couple of other photos as well of some of our other very large bears at the river. 747 from the fall, number 151 Walker, who's another really giant guy. All three of those bears have been around for much of July. Another really big bear that showed up just yesterday or the day before, number 32 Chunk. I didn't actually prep to see Chunk, a photo for this live chat because we hadn't seen him yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are all really giant bears. The average midsummer weight of a bear in Katmai National Park is probably 700 to 900 pounds. So big animals, and each one of those bears that I just mentioned is going to be at the upper end of that scale or exceeding it at this time of the year. Certainly 747, probably
Mm-hmm.
856, Chunk as well. Also 151 Walker. I mean, he's a pudgy guy. You know, as the kids say, and I'm a kid, I like to say, right? They're all chunky guys. Um, Definitely really big guys. So size matters in the bear world, and they're using their physical size to intimidate other bears. And bears are very good at recognizing which ones that they can compete with physically. And body size does matter. So that's really going to be the determining factor. But as we'll learn and as we'll talk about, certainly disposition plays a really big role. And when we're considering, let's say, the place that adult females fit into the hierarchy. We see that on display on a daily basis.
Yeah. Tude is important. And no female with cubs shows us tude like 128 grazer. And I mean, it's interesting for all these bears, weighing and balancing risk. And when we see 128, a lot of us think of a very fierce mama bear who will defend her cubs, defend her fishing spots. We've seen her this week trying to own the riffles, which has been very productive for her. When she had her first litter, we saw her attack the most dominant, really big boars. She attacked 856, and here you see that. I mean, he's just so much bigger.
Yeah, that's incredible to see, like the size difference between those two animals.
Yeah. But to her, what was important was her feeding herself and her cubs, having enough energy to take care of her cubs and make sure that that big giant bear didn't harm her cubs. So, but if she's comfortable in a spot, she's not just going to go willy nilly after another bear. Now, she did that at first when she had her first litter, but she's learned. And so she doesn't do that all the time. Now, another female with a cub this year, Holly, Bear 435, she has a different strategy, which is more avoidance. I mean, she knows that she probably can't come up against 856 and win. And if you were watching the cams at all recently, we've seen Holly and her yearling cub come up to the riffles, but really not hang around. And she did that twice last night. She came up, she saw a more dominant in this moment female, 128, kind of open, owning that space. Another thing that Holly does in figuring out her place is understanding what her cubs are capable of. And her cub is uncomfortable at this point with the current, so she moved back. But both these bears, 435 and 128, act very differently when they're single females. So, Mike, what's the place of a single female
Yeah,
in
and
the bear hierarchy?
the with those mothers and cubs, I think their presence in the hierarchy and how high maybe they sit is largely based on circumstances. As you were mentioning, Grazer, she's extremely defensive. She's willing to stand up to other larger bears, but she's not really kind of going out of her way consistently, especially when she's single. And this is, yeah, this video here, I mean, that's Grazer pushing a larger bear off of a cliff across the waterfall. It happened real fast. Maybe that's something that we could show again. That was number 83 that fell off of the waterfall. So that that demonstrates, how far, she's kind of willing to go to defend her offspring. But it's circumstantial. And if everyone's wondering about 83's status, he looks fine.
Yeah.
He's always beat up at this time of the year. That's normal for him. But he's walking around quite fine, so he didn't look like he really
And,
ended up suffering from that.
and I was sorting through photos today, and he's got a belly on him, so he's not doing badly. It's okay.
So yeah, it's a lot of circumstantial interactions, while you may find like those dominant bears, like 747 or 856, going out of their way consistently to challenge other bears. And we're not seeing Grazer do that except when she's maybe defending her offspring. But people often wonder, Naomi, to get back to your point when you were asking me earlier about single females, where do they fit into the hierarchy? And they certainly have like their own, tiers within that class of bears. And it depends on their body size, it depends on their health, it depends on their attitude, as you were mentioning as well. So we have like the adult males at the top of the hierarchy, then the mix of females. But the females, they tend to be more tolerant of each other than we see a lot of times with the adult males. We don't see them uh, aggressively displacing other females as often. They certainly will, but not as much as adult males. But one place that maybe our audience can watch for that is on the Lipperbrook Falls.
Yes.
402, for instance, a big female, maybe one of the larger adult females that we have here. She'll go up there. She'll compete with space with adult males, with younger females that like to fish that spot as well. So look for that. Certainly, single females will fit into the hierarchy in their own way. But since they're not defending cubs, they don't necessarily have to be as defensive or feel like they need to attack other bears to defend space as much.
Right, like we see the males establishing their place in the hierarchy, and they do it frequently at the beginning of the season. And we'd see a bear like 747 for a few weeks just saying, that bear, that boar, I want to let him know that I am the boss now. And he will go purposely and have a confrontation, not necessarily a fight, but just to let that other boar know. And we don't see the females really doing that. If there's competition for a fishing spot or another bear comes near their cubs, then under those circumstances, they will try to exert their power and defense.
Absolutely. And we've talked about the adult bears so far, but there's a class of bear that has it kind of rough when we're talking about dominance and the hierarchy, and those are the little tykes,
Yeah.
the independent juvenile bears that we like to call sub-adults.
Yeah, there are teenagers of the bear world, and they are at the bottom of the bear hierarchy around here. And they have a lot of learning to do. They're some just newly emancipated from their mom, so they don't have the protection of mom anymore, like we just talked about. They're hungry, they're growing up, but they need to grow out as well. They're figuring out their relationships with other subadults. Maybe their relationships with their siblings are changing, but they are taught about rank from the very start. If you watch a litter of cubs, you will see them sometimes fighting with each other over resources, over mom's milk, or maybe if she's gotten some fish that they want. And pretty soon you can see some ranking. You can see who the feisty cub in that litter will be. And that continues on. And then when they're subadults, they start having relationships with other subadults. And that can be maybe rank and availability to food, or it can be play. And some of that play is, well, it's how they learn how to fight later on. So they're building skills to potentially move up in the hierarchy. And they're not concerned about mates at this point because they're not sexually mature. So really for them, it's about establishing safe relationships, playful relationships, and staying away from those more dominant, larger bears. So during an interaction between bears, I mean, what are we really looking at? What can we expect to see from a dominant bear confronting a more submissive bear?
We've talked a lot about like kind of the nuts and bolts of where individual bears may fit into the hierarchy, and you can predict with reasonable accuracy where an individual bear is going to fit just based on whether it's an adult male or an adult female or an adult female with cubs and down to subadult bears. But yeah, we haven't talked yet about maybe the visual signs that you can look for when you're watching the webcams that will help you to determine who the quote unquote winner is. And we're going to bring up a clip here of 747 and 856. These are River's two most dominant bears this year. This is footage that happened earlier this year. 856 caught a salmon below the waterfall, moved up to the top of the waterfall to eat it. And then 747 comes into this area. Here he comes now with a direct approach. So that's one of the things to look for. When you're looking for whether a bear is behaving in a dominant manner, look for him to approach another bear directly, not to kind of skirt the boundaries of them, but a directed approach. And they're not always going to try to displace the other bear, but sometimes, yeah, that's a key indicator, a direct approach. Now, at this point in time, when I was watching this on the webcam, I was not sure if we were going to see kind of like a clear-cut winner from this interaction. 856, he continues to eat his fish. He's guarding his fish there. 747, he's hard to see in the trees there, but eventually, he starts marking the trees in that vicinity, and that's a pretty bold move. When you're next to a bear as big as 856, and again, maybe a 900-pounder or more, and you're marking a tree, that certainly says, hey, I'm feeling big, I'm feeling tough, I'm feeling confident in this situation.
It doesn't put him in a more vulnerable position. So you're saying, well, I don't care about vulnerability. I'm not really vulnerable next
Right,
to you.
right, yeah. So 856, and this goes on for a little bit, where they end up posturing, but the interaction actually continues afterwards. And I think this clip is actually more telling about who wins the interaction. You see 856 moving away from the top of the falls, and then 747 comes in and he just snowplows. He just bulldozes that willow directly towards 856. Again, a tremendous challenge there. That is not something a submissive bear would do. So 747 getting right into 856's face here. With that directed approach, you can see 856 backing up as well, mouth open on both of those animals, kind of in a little bit of a threat there. 747's ears positioned a little farther forward than 856, and 856 continuing to back away to the approach of 747. And now we know that this interaction sort of ends and there's a quote unquote winner when we see one bear walking away. Uh, and yeah, this is something different that we wouldn't have seen in years past. We wouldn't have seen 856 yield so easily. He would have stood his ground. He would have been maybe the aggressor in this situation. Now 747 right here, turning and walking away. And in this instance, because he wasn't competing over a fishing spot, he was looking to establish his dominance over 856. That shows that's why he walked away. He turned his back. Again, it was like saying, I don't consider you a threat to me anymore. I'm just going to go about my business, and tough luck, little guy.
When you observed that, were you surprised that there was no physical altercation, given the fact that 856 had been so dominant for so long?
Not not necessarily. It's possible that they had interacted before we saw
Hmm.
them that morning on the webcams, and they had fought that year. But they've definitely fought in the past physically. But again, it goes back to the fact that bears are very good at reading the body language of other bears. They're very good at assessing their own body language. Yeah, another look at this from the Falls low cam of 747 just plowing through and approaching 856. So it this is how a lot of interactions between dominant bears settle out. They don't necessarily result in a physical fight. They're both very good at reading the other's body language.
That's important too, because again, as we said, injury is something to be avoided at all costs. But if that cost of fighting is worth it to you, you'll risk that
Certainly,
injury.
and we've seen that with 747 in the past. A couple of years ago,
Hmm.
during a play-by-play broadcast up at the Falls, 747 was in the face of another really large bear, and and it looked like he was more dominant. But then that other bear came and challenged him. 747 didn't back down. They got into a really intense fight, and 747 ended up losing. So there is certainly a risk involved in that. Uh, but yeah, when you're looking at two bears, one really important point before we move on, when you're looking at two really dominant bears and they're not interacting over a singular resource, so like let's say a fishing spot or maybe a female who's in estrus, it's the winner who's going to walk away from that situation. If 747 wanted the jacuzzi, that plunge pool below the falls, he would have stayed there. He wouldn't have walked away from it. 856 would have been the one to walk away from that encounter. But those will give you some indications. Look for ear position. Generally, dominant bears, when they're approaching a subordinate bear, they're going to have their ears upright on their head. They're they're going to be looking with a directed approach, a direct stare, and the other bears are going to maybe lower their head down and have their ears, kind of flat on the back of their head as well. Those are a couple of things that you can look for.
Good. So, so when we talk about tolerance, of bears with each other. One of the things that we talk about is, for instance, mating season for the male bears. Um, if a big boar has his eyes on a particular female, he's not going to have a lot of tolerance of another male around. Now, if that other male is more dominant, that first bear is not going to win out, and he's going to lose access to that female. But the other thing is space. As you mentioned, if you're wanting a particular space, you want that fishing hole, or you maybe your space bubble is bigger than some other bears, so there will be that kind of competition for space. We see that a lot with the younger bears. Like if you see it on the lip of the falls, you'll see that competition for space. And sometimes they'll accommodate each other and it'll be okay, and sometimes it won't. But the other really big one where dominance and hierarchy are so important is about food availability. And so and we see variances in food availability over the years, and it changes greatly around here. So, Mike, what kind of variances do we see in food availability, and how does that affect the dominance and hierarchy?
Yeah, I think that's something that's clear this year, especially if you were able to watch the cameras last year or the year before or in 2018, for instance. We saw more fish in Brooks River. So every year it's going to fluctuate naturally. But if you tuned into the cams for the first time last year, I mean, you got a real treat. We had never seen anything close to the number of salmon that we saw last year. For the greater Naknek River watershed, which Brooks River, again, which is behind us, is part of, more fish returned to the greater Naknek watershed last year than at any other point in time in since record keeping began for the salmon runs up here. So it was an incredible year for the fish. It was an incredible year for the bears. We saw the bears basically released from food competition last year. So there was little competition over space for fishing spots because there were fish everywhere. You didn't have to compete over the jacuzzi or the lip of the waterfall. You could catch fish virtually everywhere. In the lower river behind us, bears were scavenging for dead and dying salmon at this time of the year because there were so many. There's always a small percentage that just kind of don't make it above the waterfall or whatever. So they were doing really well down here. And now it's a clear contrast. It's well within the normal range of variability. The Naknek watershed this year, the number of fish coming into it is still very strong. There's just less or fewer fish coming into the watershed this year, and it's certainly not so little salmon coming to the Brooks River that everyone should panic and be like the salmon run is a failure, it's a disaster. It's certainly not the case. But we're seeing what the difference between a lot of salmon can do for bears versus fewer salmon, and how that is changing the behavior of these bears, how bears have to compete with one another more aggressively for the preferred fishing spots, how we see bears maybe even fighting over scraps of fish that last year they would not even look at hardly.
Right. And it also shows the importance of dominance in the hierarchy, because I'm sure, those of you who have been watching the cams um, have seen that the bears who are catching the most fish are the ones who are most dominant in those areas. 128 grazer in the riffles has been catching a lot of fish there, and she's more dominant, established a certain level of dominance there. And it's the big boys who are really catching the fish in the prime fishing spots at the falls.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I think that makes bear cam interesting, and watching bears here at Brooks River interesting. It's not only that we know these individual animals, or we can recognize them as individual animals, it's also how they adapt to the different circumstances on a yearly basis. And that's maybe a thing that you don't have the opportunity to do at many other national parks where maybe you're seeing wildlife. So it's fascinating to see. Again, the fewer salmon are moving through Brooks River compared to last year, but and I expected to see more just based on the overall salmon numbers for this watershed. But again, it's a normal part of the natural variability of what goes on here. But one final point, maybe, Naomi, before we get to our conclusion and try to answer a few audience questions that we have queued up, I wanted to bring up some statistics about um, the advantages of being a dominant animal. And I mentioned these last year, but I think it's important to reiterate. And this is about bear 856, who had been the river's most consistently dominant bear for about a decade or so. And one of my, kind of nerdy things that I like to do while I'm here, and anybody who comes to Brooks River and sees me on the platform will see me with my trusty notebook. It's really never far from me when I'm outside here. But I like to take notes on how the bears are interacting with one another and actually score which bears are displacing others, which bears are, again, quote unquote winners in these interactions. So from 2011 to 2019, minus a couple of years where I really wasn't present at the river, I tried to keep those statistics. And I noted in total not about, but according to my spreadsheet, 1,745 interactions between bears. 856 was involved in 575 of those. So that says that he was doing a lot of stuff at the river. It could also indicate that he was just present at the river a lot. But I think the way that those interactions were scored is very, very telling about how he ranked in the hierarchy during those years. Because in only two instances really did I note him yielding to another bear, and that was in instances where he faced a particularly defensive mother at that time. I only saw one time where another bear tried to steal a fish from him and it didn't work, and that bear never tried it again. But half of the interactions that he was involved in was just other bears avoiding him. So once he's able to establish that high level of dominance, those dominant bears don't often have to work very hard. And I think that's a really important point. A lot of times when people will say, well, why is that bear wasting energy going over and challenging that other bear? But it pays dividends in the long run. Again, with 856, it certainly did. With 747 even in the past, 747 just got out of his way until this year. And it's not surprising that the hierarchy has shifted this year because 856 is in his early 20s. He's not a young bear. To remain at the top of the hierarchy as long as he did was quite exceptional. And he is a special bear in his own way.
I mean, and to think about that he got to the top of the hierarchy when he was about 12. And another thing we shouldn't be surprised about is we see bear 151 sort of strutting his stuff because he's bigger now and he's 14. So that he's really at his prime now and at a time when that behavior and personality is changing. So age and size and again, that's part of the attitude.
It'll be fascinating to see how these things change in the future. 747, this could be the only year for him to be maybe at the very, very tippy top of the hierarchy. He's a big guy. 856 is a big guy. They'll always, be fairly high in the hierarchy, but we really don't know how it's going to shift over the coming years, and that's an important thing to watch for. So the bear hierarchy, I think, is a fascinating topic. Naomi, thanks for joining me to discuss it. It's going to change every year. It's exciting. It's fascinating to watch, and it really does demonstrate the adaptability of the animals. Yes. and the conflict and competition that they face on a daily basis.
So I will say for bears, size counts, and for rangers, nerdiness counts.
Well, when I was a ranger, then I ranked right up there at the top of the hierarchy.
Absolutely.
For sure. We're going to try to get to a few viewer questions with our time remaining. We have a few that I have in our queue here that were submitted in advance through the Ask Your Bear Cam question form. You can find the link to that below the live camera feed on the left-hand side. Look for a button there that you can submit your questions for any of our audience events in advance, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible throughout the summer. Terry was asking, has there ever been a female bear try to take down a top male bear in Katmai? And I think maybe 128 grazers, perhaps the closest that I've ever seen. I don't know if you've seen another bear as assertive as she is.
No, I mean, just that picture that we showed before of her not backing down from 856. I mean, I kind of looked at that picture and thought 856 can't even believe that it's happening to him. But she's the one that I really think about. It's just an incredible moment.
Yeah, she is. She's not a small female,
Right.
so she's a good sized bear. But that again, the adult males can be, uh, maybe twice as big as some of the adult females here. So that's a tremendous size difference overall. So when you have that much muscle and body mass, you're it's a lot harder for other bears to displace you. But size isn't everything. It matters a lot in the bear world. But yeah, definitely assertiveness and defensiveness rank into that. I remember during my first few summers when I was here, a bear number 415, I think, she was feisty. She would be on the lip and she would back down larger adult males. We've never seen a female really get to the very, very top of the hierarchy because, again, as you mentioned before, it's a lot of circumstantial dominance. They're not going out of their way to assert themselves over other bears. It's mostly just like if they feel like they can defend that particular fishing spot, or if they feel like they need to defend their cubs in a particular situation. That's how they kind of attain dominance. But it's a little bit different than what you see with 856 or 747.
Yeah.
All right, and another question that we'll talk about here is from Stacy. So, and she asks, if the hierarchy has changed and 747 is now dominant over 856, how will 503 and the other bears know that? Can they see or smell it?
Well, I don't know about the smell. You can talk about that. They can certainly see it. I mean, because 747 is, as we talked about, gone out of his way to show that he is the dominant bear. I mean, if there is a large bear approaching and 747 thinks it's worth his time, he will go up to that bear and push that bear out of that fishing spot, or just go up, as you saw with 856, and show, hey, I'm the guy you got to listen to. So they've experienced it. They've experienced that dominance. And what to me was very interesting last night at the fall spotted, and it seems like those top bears don't have to do that kind of proving of their position anymore. They've done that. They've established that. The other bears are moving away. A bear like 503, who's big but still young, and a very sociable bear, he knows to get out of the way, and he did get out of the way of those bears.
Yeah, um, they certainly seem to be able to recognize dominant bears very easily. So if you're a subordinate bear, you're a smaller bear, you can tell, just based on maybe another bear's size or the way that you are feeling overall, that um, that you don't want to tangle with that other bear. But also, yeah, through the olfactory cues, through scent, bears probably are communicating that as well. So when a bear rubs his back on a tree, when he stomps on the ground and does that cowboy walking thing, that's one thing we didn't actually talk about. But that's a signal among adult males that happens most often during the mating season, where they are they're leaving a lot of scent behind. So it's not only like a physical gesture and display that says to other bears, "Hey, I'm feeling strong and confident." They have glands on the bottom of their feet. They have glands on their skin and their back, so they're leaving scent behind when they're doing that. The adult males are also peeing all over the ground when they're cowboy walking and rubbing on trees too. So they're spreading scent in their urine. They have anal glands like a dog does, and all of those things, since a bear's sense of smell is so keen, communicates many things about probably their fitness, maybe their genetic quality, and just again how big or how strong they might be feeling. So yeah, it's again one of those things that I don't think scientists have completely described, or something that we don't completely understand. But um, it's it's um, it's something that they're still figuring out. But bears certainly know how to communicate um, with each other, even if we can't understand it.
You
And
just got to learn how to translate, Mike. That's all. Your
absolutely, yeah.
next job.
If we could talk bear, but as I've written before, if we could talk to bears and they could talk to us, we would not understand their vocabulary based on scent. It's We just wouldn't
Yeah.
have the words for it at all. They would be able to describe so much about their environment just based on scent, and we would have no idea what they're talking about.
Right.
So another question, yeah, could you explain the difference between a bear's behavior if the ears are forward versus pinned back as it relates to dominance? And this is a question from David. He actually, we couldn't fit his whole question in our box here, so we had to truncate it. But he was wondering about how I, in the past, have described, and during this broadcast, about how ears position forward on a bear can indicate, maybe a sign of assertiveness or dominance, while he's read that in bear and human encounters, a bear that approaches with a head low and ears back is likely in attack mode. So he's wondering if I can explain sort of like the contradiction and the difference. And yeah, a bear with its ears back on its head and its head low, if you're encountering a bear in that situation, that bear is feeling defensive. So that's a clear sign to you that you want to behave in a way to de-escalate the situation. Whether that is, here at Brooks River, sometimes that's backing away because a lot of the bears are used to encountering people at close distances. Or if you're maybe for safety's sake, it's best just to stand your ground and let the bear decide how it wants to avoid the encounter. But yes, certainly a bear that is feeling defensive will lower its head and put its ears back on its head. So if you end up surprising a bear at a close distance, a lot of times in descriptions of bear attack, that's what the people will end up seeing. And a couple of bears here, actually. Yeah, great picture. Thanks for bringing that up, Candace, of two bears competing over a scrap of fish. Both had their ears back on their head because they were both being defensive in that situation.
Right. We saw some of that on the lip last night where 402 was there and a couple of younger bears, and it was defensive. They were, each one wanted to defend his or her position on the lip of the falls, and it wasn't a dominant display. It was, they were all defensive.
Now, in bear and human interactions, bears can approach people with their head up and ears forward. And what that's going to signal is curiosity and, in rare circumstances, even predatory instincts out of the bear. So you can read bear behavior. If you learn to read bear behavior, you can understand really well what's on the bear's mind. Bears, within my experience, don't deceive. They don't have the ability to lie. Some of our great ape relatives and certainly human have that ability, but I haven't seen evidence of that in brown bears. So they're going to tell you what's on their mind. So if a bear is looking at you like it's approaching your campsite or something like that, head up, ears forward, it's maybe just looking towards you out of curiosity. It could be food conditioned and looking for food. It may be looking to displace you from that habitat. So those are, yeah, a couple of contrasts between what a person might encounter.
Yeah.
If I do see a bear approaching me and I move out of its way, for instance, here at Brooks River, and it gets off the path and it's still like looking at me, big eyes, ears up, and I can't dissuade it, then yeah, that bear is very curious for some reason or another. And then I may take a more active approach to dissuade that bear by stomping my feet, clapping my hands if I'm next to a tree or a shrub, shaking that, making yourself look big to try to dissuade. You want to dissuade curious bears. You want to make sure that you're not threatening a defensive bear.
Yeah, this is a really good explanation of what happens when we have close encounters with bears here, because, and a very good explanation why you never see photos from me when I have a close encounter with a bear. You'll get the story in writing, but you're not going to see a picture because I am looking at that bear to see what that bear is telling me. And we are going to do a chat with Ranger Nick later in the season about bear language, because no one spends more time communicating with bears than the bear techs here in bear management at Brooks River.
They insert themselves into the hierarchy at the lodge, basically, while trying to keep bears away.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll be talking to Ranger Nick and hear some of the nuances of bear language from him.
Well, thanks for everyone's questions. And I know there's a ton more in our question forum. We'll try to answer as many of those throughout the summertime. But this, talking about the bear hierarchy and dominance is always fun for me. It's something that you can witness on the Brooks Falls cam, especially at this time of the year. So I encourage everyone to try to follow the ebb and flow of the hierarchy and understand how bears are surviving in this competitive environment. My name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. My co-host today has been Ranger Naomi Boak from Katmai National Park. Thanks for joining us today. And as we like to say at Explore.org, never stop learning.
Hello. There is no better way to understand the challenges that brown bears face and health of an ecosystem like the Brooks River than to examine the life of the sows and the cubs that live here. Welcome. I'm Katmai Ranger Naomi, and with me today are Mike Fitz, Explorer's resident naturalist who is in Maine, and I am here on the Brooks River, which you see behind me, and behind that is the lovely Dumpling Mountain. And also joining us is Katmai Ranger Leon, and she is in King Salmon, which is where our headquarters are. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Good evening.
Great to have you here. So I couldn't help smiling as we were watching the footage of the family groups as just before we came on, and family groups are certainly on our minds here. We have seen a lot of them over the past 2 years on the cameras, and that's because we have a really healthy ecosystem, and but a dynamic ecosystem. So we're seeing them in different places and responding in different ways. From the first year as a vulnerable koi or cub of the year, sows and cubs may face many challenges. They face a time of growth for the cubs, a fight to stay fat and fit for the mom, and a time of danger from predators and disease for the cubs, and a way to protect the cubs for their mom. It's a time of socialization and learning. A lot has to be learned before these cubs can go on to be independent bears. They face a dynamic world and a challenging one. But let's start at the beginning, Leon. Fat is important. It's job one here along the Brooks River, and it certainly is that for female bears. Can you tell us a little bit why fat is so important to the reproductive system for females?
Yes, absolutely. I know in so many of our live chats, we talk about salmon and its importance to the ecosystem overall, and its importance to bears in all ways. And when talking sows with cubs, it's absolutely no different. It is, again, one of those things that is incredibly important. And when we're talking about food and that importance, it all starts actually for moms pre-cubs. From the very beginning, food is important. And that's because bears practice essentially a reproductive strategy called delayed implantation. So bears, they will mate early in the season, usually around spring or early summer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have cubs. First and foremost, they need to pack on the pounds. And so those fertilized eggs, they will not implant themselves into the uterus unless she has enough fat reserves when she goes into hibernation. So when thinking about moms with cubs, always think mom comes first when it comes to food. But Mike, can you tell us a little bit more about life inside of the den?
Rearing cubs, it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and that effort is complicated by hibernation. Mother bears are the only animals that give birth and lactate while hibernating, and how they do it really is remarkable.
So Mike is not aware
consider.
that we're not hearing him.
Okay, I can hear everybody
Maybe
just
now
fine.
he is. No? Oh, it's just me that I can't hear him. Huh. Okay. I'm being singled out again. All right, I get it.
I can't hear him either, so it's both of us.
Oh,
All right.
at least I have a partner. Okay, Mike, go ahead.
All right, so what I'll do then is I'll give you the thumbs up when I'm going to send it back to someone else. So thanks for sticking with us while we work through some of these audio issues, everybody. Yeah, as I was saying before, though, rearing cubs, it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and that effort really is complicated by hibernation. Mother bears are the only animals that give birth and lactate while hibernating. So how they do that really is remarkable to consider. During gestation, a mother bear really has to draw on her protein stores. And in in the den in wintertime, those are in limited supply. So she only has so much muscle mass. She only has so much other lean tissue to draw that energy from. Of course, she's not eating in the den. And remember, that's an important point of how bears are, able to survive hibernation. They have to get beyond that point of not eating, and they're able to do that really through their body fat. Body fat typically is in abundance, but it doesn't seem to really pass through the placenta as readily as protein and sugar. So to overcome this challenge, bears give birth to especially tiny babies. This allows mother bear to switch from placental nourishment, which draws from the mom's limited supply of body protein and sugar. It switches it to milk. And that's something that mom produces with body fat, and she has that in abundance. So bear cubs are born purposely premature at birth. They're the smallest babies of any placental mammal proportionally to the size of mom. If since mother bears in Katmai can weigh 500-600 pounds, you would expect a baby bear to be closer to like 20 pounds at birth, but it's not. They're only about 1 pound when they're born. They're about 8 to 9 inches long at birth. They're blind. They're lightly furred. Their ears are closed. About the only thing they can do is eat, scream, and relieve themselves. So in that way, they're not unlike a human newborn. And when they're gaining weight in the den, I mean, that's entirely on mom. It's essentially she's transferring her energy to the cubs. And of course, there's some energy loss going on there, but the family doesn't have any other food sources. So even so, cubs grow rapidly in the den. They often weigh 5 pounds at 1 month and 15 to 20 pounds by the time they leave the den. And we have a couple of photos of a bear den to show folks who maybe haven't seen that habitat. This is the inside of a bear den on Dumpling Mountain, so on the mountain that's behind Ranger Naomi. And this is where bear cubs spend the first 4 months of their life. And I've often wondered what it's like when they leave the den for the first time, when suddenly the whole world is new to them. I mean, it's the life outside the den, that first few steps, it must be remarkable for the bear. It's a time of discovery for the cubs, but it certainly also carries risk. So Leon, what's it like when those bears take those first moments outside of the den?
Absolutely. Of all bears, sows with spring cubs, they are the last to leave the den. And when you're talking about survival rates, spring cubs, it's only around 34% or so. So when you think that maybe 2 out of every 3 spring cubs may not survive to see the next year. And it really is a reminder that bears live in a difficult world. It can be dangerous and their lives can often be short. But bears have many adaptations to really take advantage and survive. And for instance, like leaving the den last as spring cubs is one of these. It maximizes the amount of time that they are able to grow before they head out into the world. And so far this year, we've seen several family groups with spring cubs. And that includes 132, 482 Brett, and 909. Mike, did you want to speak a little bit about 909's experience on the river so far?
It's I like watching some of these new mothers at the river. 909 is one of those, is a mother bear who is raising her first cub. As far as we know, this is her first litter this year. And when you were talking about risks, and how mortality rates for first year cubs can be high, it's interesting to see how mother bears with first year cubs really alter their behavior depending on the status of their cubs, so to speak. They seem to have an awareness not only of what their own bodies are capable of, mother bears, but an awareness of what the risks are to their cubs overall. And we're seeing that really with 909, because she's a bear that fishes the lip frequently, or at least used to, and she hasn't really tried that at all this year. She's been hovering downstream of the falls, kind of at best, and most of the time avoiding the falls completely. So that's one of the things that I have found really interesting about her behavior this year when we're talking about risk to those first year cubs.
And I think it's really great with the bear cam. It allows us to actually see these things in ways that we might not otherwise. So in addition to those family groups I named, I think there are also 2 other family groups with spring cubs, each with 3 I believe. And Naomi, correct me, we do not know the ID of those families, right?
Right. We don't know the ID. There are two sows that each have three spring cubs. One was only recently seen here. We don't know the identities yet. The bear monitor has been around here on my same platform. She is very busy, so I'm not even going to ask her about the identity of those two. But we have been seeing at least one of them on the cameras a lot. She's been treeing her cubs around the riffles, and I can identify her, if not who she is, but I can identify her cubs because she has tiny, small, and large. So, and the large one is dark, and the other two are much lighter. So maybe we don't know who she is, but we can spot her along the river as a particular sow with three new cubs.
Well, whether or not we know the exact number of a bear, it is always interesting to watch spring cubs in their first year of life. And spring cubs, they can be identified, of course, by their smaller size, especially relative to mom, but they're also generally darker in fur color, and they might have a natal collar, which is essentially a lighter band of fur around their neck, which tends to fade as they grow older. But Mike mentioned before that they really only weigh a pound at birth. So these spring cubs are quite impressive. And you'll see throughout the season, they do tend to gain quite a bit of weight. And to illustrate that, we have a picture of Holly's spring cub from last year, I believe, and this was in June or so. And then towards the end of the season, we have a completely different picture, and it really shows how much that these spring cubs grow. And by the time they head into the den or so for the next winter, a healthy cub may be around 80 pounds or so. But from one winter to the next, there is a lot of life to live, there is a lot to learn. And for their first year of life, these cubs are really pretty much reliant on mom, both for food and protection. And when speaking about food, Mike talked a little bit earlier about nursing. They're primarily relying on mother's milk, maybe sometimes salmon scraps towards the end of the season. And they can drink maybe 45 ounces a day. So if a mom has a litter of 4, just think how much that takes to produce that amount. But the threats that spring cubs face, they face quite a few, and mom is their main protector too. And some of these threats are from other bears themselves. Infanticide, basically where another bear will, another great example, we're talking about bears here, and we see this 482 here eating at the same time, and it just goes to show that relying on for mom for a lot of things, a lot of different aspects, and that's multitasking, protection, and these cubs, they will stay close to mom for that. And we really see that a lot in the river. They'll stay a lot closer than perhaps in their later years of life from threats. And again, kind of going back to infanticide, it is something that any gender can commit, though we largely think of it as being the male bears, and that does typically tend to be the case. And it is definitely something that can be hard to reconcile from a human point of view, but it is important to remember that this is something natural in the bear world, and bears, they live and exist in their own world, and we need to kind of refrain from trying to put on some of those moral limitations. But yes, they stick with mom for that protection. As Mike said, we see changes in behavior. One of the ways, like Grazer, is another great example. Last year, she had spring cubs, and you rarely saw her at the lip, and now her cubs are older, and you see her fishing there quite a bit. So they do tend to stick with mom, and you'll see that also, too, as one of the things she might do. She might tree her cubs in case of threat. And I know that we saw that at the riffles, and this is a great clip which exemplifies that. So when you hear that brown bears don't climb trees, that's definitely not true. We see it in cubs all the time, and occasionally, though less so among adults. But threat and competition, yes, they exist from outside forces, but also you see it sometimes within litters. You see a little bit of sibling rivalry develop, and that starts pretty on. It might even start within the den itself, as cubs are trying to nurse and compete for some of those most productive teats and those spots there. And it's something that continues on. Competition continues throughout their life. But sibling rivalry also has its benefits. It's something that they can learn from and grow, and it really helps them as they age as well. But Naomi, can you tell us a little bit more about this next year of life with mom?
Okay, so at the end of their first season, the spring cubs go back to the den with mom, and they stay with her, and then emerge in the spring and as yearlings. And in many ways, the growth and the learning and the challenges are similar. But here we see a yearling. It is Holly's yearling, and who has a lot to learn about the perils of being around other bears, but also starts out as a very lanky bear. Leon, you talked about how much bear cubs grow. Um, Bear cubs can grow enormously in their second year. They could start out at around 100 pounds when they come back to the Brooks River. And when they emerge the following spring as 2.5-year-olds, they could be over 200 pounds. So that's a lot of growth. Now, that growth doesn't happen without a lot of help from mom. She's still feeding them and nursing them, and they're also learning how to fish. We may seem food obsessed here, but we're talking about bears, and they are food obsessed in these months they are here because they have to get fat. Leon, you want to talk a little bit about Bear 128, because she is a bear that we have seen really teaching her yearlings how to fish. Kind of starts with most yearling cubs with stealing from mom, but where does it go from there, Leon?
Absolutely. It does seem to start quite a bit with stealing. We've been able to witness her in a lot of different fishing locations. And I think back to early season when we saw her mostly fishing in the riffles. And whenever she would have success, she'd grab a fish. We would see her cubs run over and try and get as much as they can. And later on, we actually saw the cubs using some of this dash and grab technique, mimicking her a little. And later in the season, and now especially, we have been seeing those cubs and her. Yesterday, her cubs were out on the lip as well, and they found success too. So it really highlights this change between maybe the beginning of their year, where they are mostly relying on mom stealing what they can, and then seeing how much they gain over this season, being able to fish some for their own.
Yeah, and it was wonderful to watch those cubs last night on the cams, if any of you had the opportunity, because Grazer moved back from the lip and she let those cubs fish on their own. And again, when you mentioned rivalry and differences, and those personalities start when they're very young, and you could see the difference in the two cubs. One was ready to fish like mom, the other wasn't. So cubs in their second year are very much learning how to fish like mom. They're learning fishing techniques, they're learning fishing spots, but they're also learning from other bears. We use the example of 128 grazer on the lip, but how do those male cubs learn how to fish in places like the jacuzzi? Because we don't see very many sows fishing in the jacuzzi. So those cubs, maybe they're watching mom, but they're also watching and learning from other bears. So they eventually, those cubs turn into bears that can try and fish in the jacuzzi or other spots. Um, but learning how to fish is not the only thing that these guys need to learn. They need a lot of socialization skills, and in particular, because they are on the Brooks River, where resources are concentrated, and they must deal with other bears. They learn socialization a lot as yearlings. It begins as spring cubs, but they carry that into their next year. There's, as Leon mentioned, socialization within the family group, and there's socialization without the family group. When cubs have siblings, they play with each other. As you see here, 128's cubs playing with each other. But it's very interesting that socialization carries over from spring cubs to yearlings to emancipation. Last year, we had 25 cubs, and we had a very different river. It was lower, more fish in the lower river. So family groups played together, and spring cubs got to know each other. And here we have the cub of bear 806 and the cub of bear 435 Holly playing together a couple of weeks ago as yearlings. And they met each other the year before. And I think it illustrates very well how bears learn to live and thrive in this environment. And they will take that with them once they're on their own. And a lot of learning has to do with how to survive once they don't have mom's protection and they don't have her to help them eat. Singleton bears, like cubs that don't have siblings, like 806 and 435's cubs, they found each other. That will help them greatly when they become independent. And once they are no longer able to rely on mom when they are on their own, after they've been kind of booted out of the home like we do with our kids, um, they need to know what relationships to have. They're going to be at the bottom of the hierarchy, but those relationships that they establish with their siblings and other cubs and what their mom taught them about other bears will help them thrive and survive around other more dominant bears and also their peers. And once they're emancipated, there are lots of challenges of independence. But Leon, not all cubs leave mom at 2.5. What can we say about moms that keep their kids around for a little longer?
Yeah, I mean, in Katmai, the average is 2.5, but occasionally you'll see bears keep cubs for another season. And a good example of that is 708 Amelia this year. She has kept her cubs an additional summer. And we know that 708 actually has a history of doing this. So it's not uncommon. And last year, 9-4 also kept her cubs an additional year. And you can see they grow quite large with that extra year with mom and that extra protection. But Mike, no matter how long these cubs have with mom, they're always learning from her because dad isn't in the picture, right? It's mostly mom.
It is, yeah. So male bears don't play any role in actually raising offspring. There's debate whether in the scientific literature and amongst a lot of bear cam watchers and people like me who just talk to rangers about their experiences as well, is whether male bears can recognize their former mates. And if that's so, maybe they can kind of put two and two together and say, well, I mated with that mom, and oh, maybe those cubs are mine. We're not really sure whether they recognize cubs as their own or not. Maybe they recognize their mate, but that could be about as far as it goes. So moms really are the ones that are transferring knowledge to cubs, and mother bears pass on their knowledge and experience to cubs, kind of through example, like when we've seen with Grazer on the lip of the falls this year. She's showing her cubs, hey, this is a great place to be. And really, in a sense, they're forming like matrilineal cultures associated with food and a lot of the in different bear populations, and you can see how that can be almost or provide a great advantage to young bears at Brooks River. Most bears probably experience this place for the first time with their mom. She's the only one she's the one who introduces them to salmon and how to safely navigate the challenges of the place. And so not only do we see weaned offspring come back to the river to fish, but sometimes they'll fish in the same place as mom. And I want to bring up an example of that with number 409 Bead Nose. She was a very famous bear during the early years of bear cam, and a bear that I love to watch on the lip of the falls, an expert angler. Her last litter, though, that we know of, that was born in 2016, she brought back to Brooks River, and as yearlings, those bears went to the waterfall with mom and fished the lip, or at least stood next to her while she fished the lip. And now those bears are back One of them is number 910, and the other one is number 909, which I mentioned before. And this is her just a couple of years ago as a young bear, independent, learning how to fish the waterfall. So we'll see these offspring come back to the river because they know this is a productive place to gain food, or to find food, to gain body mass. And we'll sometimes see them practicing the same techniques that their mother did. And you can envision why, and it may be a little easy to understand how this knowledge passed from generation to generation provides bears with great advantage. But in a world where brown, black, and polar bears are coming into closer contact with people as we reshape climate and bear habitat, these food cultures can also lead bears into conflict with people. Mother bears especially if mother bears discover and exploit human sources of food, things like garbage, pet food, bird seed. Cubs absorb that knowledge just as easily as they absorb the knowledge that salmon are great to eat. And they'll remember that lesson. And for them, they're just animals trying to make a living. In the easiest way they can, human food provides a temptation that they can't ignore. And this can lead to sort of a revolving door of conflict between people in different generations of bears who've learned that human habitations are great places to find food. So that those matrilineal cultures is something that we can witness on bear cam, but it's something that happens in other places as well. Unfortunately, in some national parks, and communities outside of those parks, it can lead to a lot of conflict in between bears and people. But raising cubs is a challenging task. It's fascinating to follow, Naomi. We've covered a lot of ground today. And before we get to some of our viewer questions that we have queued up, I think it's important to consider how bear family life represents some of the most engaging, endearing, and challenging moments that we see on bear cam.
Yeah, we have been very lucky to witness a lot on the cams with these family groups, and because we have had such a healthy ecosystem here, we've had a lot of family groups. There were 25 cubs here last year, and I don't know what the count is this year. I haven't dared ask the bear monitor yet, but so there have been years here where I understand it would be a great thing if one sow returned with spring cubs. So we're witnessing a dynamic ecosystem which is currently very healthy, but undergoes changes. So the sows, I so admire them when I watch them. They have the challenge of providing food for their cubs, providing food for themselves, providing safety, which means risk for them. There's danger from not only predators but from disease, and these moms have to multitask. They have to provide transportation, as we see here. They have to teach their bears how to eventually become independent while protecting them and actually protecting themselves. So I have great admiration for these family groups, and I have great admiration for the place where they live and thrive. And as we've seen, last year's fishing for them is very different. And last year they were able to relax. There were fewer people on the river. The water wasn't as high. They were able to fish in the lower river earlier. They were less threatened by predators in the lower river. So they hung out together. So there was more socialization between the cubs, a great thing for their development. This year, there's a different kind of learning process and a different kind of socialization going on because the river has changed. The river is much higher in the lower river. It's really almost impossible to fish. I watched Holly the other day dive and not be very successful at it, which I think tells you how deep the river is. So we've seen sows take greater risks, even with their spring cubs, to be at a crowded falls. So I think that because we are seeing such thriving animals and we have such an amazing environment in which they exist, we have to think about how we protect them and how we protect this environment and see to it that we don't encroach on it too much and that they can use their abilities as opportunists and adaptable and smart animals to take advantage of what there is here. And I must say that a lot of that opportunity exists because of the Herculean work of these moms. So I'm going to leave it at that and say I think we have some time for a few questions. Mike, you want to see about some questions from our viewers?
Yeah, I think we'll try to answer a bear cam question form, and you can find a link to that below the live camera feed on the left-hand side of the page. So if you have any questions for myself or the Rangers, please throw those in there. We try to answer as many of those as possible. And somebody was wondering, has anyone tracked litter success rate by singletons as opposed to siblings, like if you have 2 or 3 cubs? It's hard to say because most of the time, and feel free to add additional information, Leon and Naomi, if you have any. But when we see a bear coming to the river with 1 cub, that doesn't mean that the mother bear had just 1 cub. She could have had 2 or 3, and somehow got separated from those other cubs in the trek to the river. So we're not really sure if larger litters have higher rates of mortality than a small litter. I just don't know.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's hard to say.
I was just going to say that this question, whoops. All right, we're going to sing this together. I was just to make a slight comment that this question exemplifies how much we don't know about bears and these wild bears in this environment. Go ahead, Leon.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And when you think about bears afterwards too, because not all of them will return to Brooks River once they're emancipated as subadults or as adults. So if you're thinking about long-term success as well, that is another thing that's hard to know.
And we've seen some examples of mother bears nursing their cubs on the cameras recently. There was a great capture, I think maybe from the Riffles cam a few days ago. And somebody was wondering, and seeing that and seeing how the cubs will change teats frequently. And again, Grazer has 2 yearlings, so they can drink a lot of milk. But do the teats run out of milk? And if so, how long does it take them to refill? That's another question I'm not sure. I looked, for answers to that, and I haven't been able to find any definitive knowledge.
The questions are just too good here.
Yeah, so I'm unsure. It seems like some of the teats on mother are more productive than others. We often will see cubs prefer like the top 2 teats on mom. She actually has 6 of them. She has 2 on her chest and 1 and a pair that are kind of close to the bottom of her abdomen. So it seems like some will produce milk at greater rates than others. But I think in large litters, certainly demand outstrips supply, like Leon was mentioning earlier in the broadcast. Spring cubs sometimes can demand as much as 45 ounces of milk a day. So that's a lot of milk for mother to produce. And how old are the cubs before their system is able to digest salmon? Any ideas on that? When do we really start to see the cubs start to eat a lot of fish?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, today on the cams, we saw a spring cub take a salmon remains up the tree with it, which I thought was kind of extraordinary. We do see spring cubs starting to eat salmon. They get the idea pretty quickly from mom that this is a good thing. They certainly seem to like it. I haven't asked any of them, but I thought that was a really good example about how early it can happen. But Mike, when do they really start moving more to salmon?
Well, from what I've read and what I've seen as well, it seems like they investigate anything that mother shows an interest in. So it can happen pretty early on, as soon as mom starts catching salmon. But it is interesting, and you two have probably seen this as well. Maybe like the first time mom catches a fish, and those spring cubs have never seen mom do it, and mom runs back to the bank with that fish in her mouth, and the cubs are like a little weirded out by it. They're like, wait, what is mom running for? And what is this strange thing in her mouth? But once they see that she starts to eat it, all of a sudden they're like, oh, hey, this is interesting. Um, but their digestive tract at that point in the year in early summer probably isn't mature enough to allow them to survive on salmon, but usually around this time of the year. So let's say midsummer, I think is when their digestive system becomes mature enough to survive without milk, if that happened, if they happen to be separated from mother or something like that. So right around this time of year. And Leon, I'll throw this question to you. This is another one we probably don't know the answer to. But is there some genetic advantage for spring cubs to be dark and yearlings to be lighter? I mean, we definitely see the first year cubs much darker than yearlings. Yearlings are almost always blonder than spring cubs.
Yeah, it's just another one of those times where we're going to say, I don't know. There's so much we don't know, and I don't know if there is a genetic advantage in terms of their coat color. And we see change in coat color in adult bears too, but it's so noticeable, like you said, for first year cubs too, especially yearlings.
And also another question related to cubs: how does emancipation generally happen, or the family separation process? When does that happen, and how does that happen? So maybe first we can talk about when it happens, and then maybe elaborate on how it happens.
Well, when it generally happens is after the second hibernation, or the third hibernation, right? They're born in that first one, they have a go back with mom, and then after they're hibernating after yearlings, and in the spring, that's generally when we see it happen. Sometimes we see sows with 2.5-year-olds make it here, and they're with their cubs one day and they're not the next. And as Leon mentioned, there are those sows like bear 708 and bear 94 who like to hang on to their cubs for another year. Mike, have you actually seen emancipation?
Well, the only time that I've actually seen families separate was in July of 2014, when 402 separated from the bear that we now know as 503, and that's an odd time of the year for it to happen. And I didn't quite understand what was going on, because 503 was just a yearling then, and that's a year earlier than most bears separate from their moms. So weird time of the year. It was also a year earlier than normal. And that's why I didn't understand what was going on. But I think what we saw was kind of a normal separation process. 402 went into estrus, and a male bear started to take interest in her and started to follow her around. She wasn't providing the yearling with really much care. The yearling tried to keep up for a while, and then was like, I don't like this situation. Mom's not around. That big dude is following her. I'm just going to have to make my way on my own. And I think that's probably kind of like a normal separation process under a lot of circumstances. But I've also read instances where mother bears might become intolerant of their weaned offspring and kind of chase them away. It's no matter what, it's probably a shocking event, I think, for those young bears. And what about the water temperature at Brooks River? We've all felt the water. The three of us here, we felt the water at Brooks River. It's very cold. So how do cubs cope with that cold water? They don't have the body mass of a larger bear.
Leon, you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, we've definitely talked about the water temperature before, and even now it's probably somewhere in the 50s. And so I know that we've seen a lot of cubs, especially spring cubs, they aren't necessarily swimming themselves, or they'll spend shorter amounts of time there. I've often seen them huddled together off to the side a little bit. But even so, they do, even without that insulation of adult bears, they do have a pretty good fur coat overall.
And when they're yearlings, oops. I was going to say, when they're yearlings, they seem to be in the water more, but you see every once in a while they'll pick their paws out like it's too cold. So they've got to really grow into that resistance to colder water, I think.
The other one thing that I wanted to mention too about this is you also have to consider what they're doing outside of the water and what the environment is like away from the water. So, I mean, we know that the river is very cold, but it's often very damp and chilly in Katmai in summer. A lot of times the daytime highs are in the 50s and it's drizzling all day. So the bears are just soaked. So they must have some tolerance for that just built into them. Otherwise, I don't think they would be able to survive in a lot of those environments. They're just better equipped physiologically to handle, being cold and wet. Maybe that requires them to burn more calories. Who knows? But yeah, they don't like it when they're really young, being in cold water as much as the adults. But they seem to be able to handle it as best they can. And one final question here for the three of us: how does cub survival change over time as they become yearlings and subadults and full adults? Leon, do you want to kind of reiterate some of those survival statistics for younger bears, and then maybe I'll try to remember what what the survival rates are for some of the older bears?
Sure. Spring cubs in their first year, that is when they are the most vulnerable. And so that's when we see perhaps the lowest survival rate. It's around 34% or so. But as they get older, this percent definitely increased. Mike, can you tell us more about those stats?
Yeah, I think most yearlings have a much higher survival rate than spring cubs. So, it can be upwards of, if I remember correctly, and I apologize for not looking this up beforehand, but somewhere, closer to 70 or 80% across the year, sometimes higher. And then when you're looking at adults, not, more than 9 out of 10 adults will survive from year to year. It could be higher, to closer to 95% of adults will survive from year to year. Subadults, I haven't really been able to track down statistics on that, especially for Katmai National Park. That statistic that Leon used for the mortality rate of spring cubs, that comes from a study done on the Pacific side of Katmai National Park in the 1990s. So it was over, it's maybe 5 or 6 years or so, but the park hasn't made any efforts to kind of track that again. So we don't know if that's like the current rate or not. I mean, it varies, but certainly the older a bear gets to a certain point, once they reach adulthood, it seems like they have a very high survival rate in the park overall. But it's been a great conversation with the two of you today. We have a lot of bear camp events in that we're trying to plan for August, and I think we're looking forward to a lot of those and play-by-plays as long as the bears are hanging around the river. So look forward to those as well. My guest co-hosts today were Ranger Naomi Boak from Katmai National Park and Ranger Leon Law from Katmai National Park. And thanks to everyone from Explore.org for allowing us to share our knowledge and experience with everybody. And thanks, Naomi and Leon, for joining me today.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks.
And my name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. Thanks for watching. And as we'd like to say with Explore.org, never stop learning. Whether it's pain caused by injury and illness, or the stress imposed through competition and conflict, whether it's enduring prolonged famine, coping with the presence of people, or experiencing a rapidly changing climate, brown bears must remain resilient in the face of challenge and hardship in order to survive. And that's what we're discussing today. Hi, everyone. This is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. Joining me is my co-host, Ranger Naomi Voke from Katmai National Park. Naomi, always great to speak with you, and I'm glad that the weather broke a little bit for you so you can hang outside.
Thank you. Yeah, I am here on the lower river platform along the Brooks River, and you guys see the river and Dumpling Mountain behind me. And Mike, I have to tell you, we're going to have to postpone this because Holly's cub is sitting under the north platform, and it's just too much cuteness. So I'm afraid we'll have to do this later.
Well, maybe so. You might have to resist that urge to watch that bear.
All
And we'll
right.
be talking about, I think,
Okay.
Holly's cub a little bit later too. So maybe there'll be an opportunity
We will.
to work her in.
Okay.
And I'm back at my home base in northern Maine, so that's why you see the green foliage behind me. But today we're here to talk about the myriad ways bears remain resilient and to meet the challenges that they face in their lives. So if you have questions about that topic, if they come up, you're watching at home, you want to ask us questions about it, drop those in the comments. You can find the comments below the live camera feed on explore.org. And a helpful moderator from Explore will be sending those in our direction, and we'll do our best to try to answer a few of those during the broadcast and towards the end of the broadcast. Naomi, though, this is, I think for me at least, one of the more enjoyable and easier chats to develop because each bear on the river really has a unique story to tell about how it experiences and overcomes hardship. Maybe the most difficult thing about developing the outline for this is just kind of selecting the bears that we want to talk about. But I think to begin, let's start with the thing that all of Katmai bears must endure to survive from year to year, and that's the extreme famine experienced by hibernation. How are bears preparing for that challenge?
Well, it is the challenge that they face every year, and some years are easier than others. And this year is not a bad year, but it's not the easiest year. The salmon were late, and we don't have quite as many salmon as we did in the last few years. But in order to face hibernation and famine, the bears have job one, which is getting fat. And they have different strategies to do that. And it's the primary example of how bears are so adaptable to a difficult life, really. And so Bear 151 Walker is one that I'd like to talk about because Walker was kind of a small bear as a young bear. He's now 14 years old. And Walker has adapted and changed his strategy to get fat over the years. Here you see him in the riffles, which is the area 100 yards downriver from the falls. And this is where Walker tended to fish for the last few years. He doesn't have to tangle with the big boars. He doesn't have to compete for favorite fishing spots there. And he has a good place to grow and get fat. And Walker is now 14 years old. He, in the last couple of years, has gotten ginormous. He is really fat, very successful bear in preparing for the challenge of famine and hibernation. And now he can morph his strategy and take advantage of some of the more primo fishing spots along the river, like at the falls, like you see here. He's on the lip of the falls, and look how successful that bear is. So he is fat enough to face several months of famine. I mean, not just in the den, but when he comes out, there won't be any food or much of any food. So this is a way that bears are both resilient and adaptable as they change and as circumstances change. And Mike, you wanted to talk about actually the challenge of being in hibernation, and bears in hibernation do things and survive things that we could never do. Do you have an example you want to talk about?
Well, one particular bear I think that's important to highlight in this process is one that's been very prominent on the cameras really since we turned the cameras on in June, and that's 128 Grazer. She was spending a ton of time on the lip of the falls. Today, she has 2 yearling cubs this year. So when you talk about Walker, I mean, he got to worry about himself. Grazer got to worry about her 2 cubs and keeping them well fed. But those yearlings are going to go into the den like her and survive on their fat reserves. Fat is the currency that allows bears to survive winter hibernation, and they're not going to be nursing while they're in the den. So grazer not only has to protect these cubs and nurture them and teach them how to survive, but she also has to keep them well fed enough so that they get fat enough to survive during winter hibernation. And when bears go into the den, I mean, it is a significant challenge for them. Think about what a person needs to stay healthy. For instance, we need access to clean water and adequate food. We need regular exercise, and that's not necessarily running marathons. That's just like being able to move, about our day, to keep our muscles and our bones, in a healthy condition. But in a den, bears aren't eating, they're not drinking, they're not urinating, they're not defecating. They aren't, they're not exercising either. They're basically laying down most of that time. So it's a significant challenge that they need to overcome to keep themselves healthy. But over time, they've evolved really some remarkable strategies. They don't experience significant muscle loss. They don't experience significant bone issues, so they don't suffer from things like osteoporosis in the den. And a lot of scientists are still trying to tease this out and figure out how bears are doing this. But with bone health in particular, I mean, it is really amazing because we need like gravity, we need force on our bones so our bones sort of remobilize and stay healthy. But when you're laying down, let's say if a person is confined to a bed for several weeks, our bones are going to weaken during that process. Now, make that the extreme end of things and be a bear in the den hibernating for 4 to 6 months. If a person was in the same position, we would be unlikely to walk, let alone have healthy bones and muscles when they come out of the den. But bears are able to do that. They might have genes that control bone formation mechanisms, and those could be, they could be more active, I should say, in the wintertime. They might retain more vitamin D. There's other evidence that suggests that bears suppress, some of the normal mechanisms of bone turnover and reformation. And really, kind of like the sum of those efforts prevents things like brittle bones and osteoporosis in brown bears. But then, when you're thinking about muscle health, there's another challenge going on there. Because when you burn body fat, it's in a sense like a clean burning fuel for the animal. It produces metabolic water, so that's how the bears are staying hydrated. It produces body heat, so that helps to keep them warm, and then it also produces carbon dioxide, and that's just exhaled as the bear breathes. But when you burn muscle, and bears are still using some muscle even though they're in the den, that creates some other metabolic challenges. Because you're producing like ammonia waste that need to be purged from the body in some way. And that's what we do. We urinate it out and rid our bodies of that. It's filtered out through the kidneys, and voila, it's gone. Doesn't harm us. And brown bears are doing that at this time of the year. But in the den, their kidneys are almost completely shut down. So they have to come up with a different mechanism. You could store those poisons in your body, maybe sequester it in some way, but bears aren't doing that either. What they're actually doing is using those waste products and recycling it back into usable protein to keep their muscles healthy. It's really a parsimonious strategy that's quite amazing in its own way. And then lastly, before we move on, and all bears are doing this, probably in the den to some extent, they're able to heal wounds. And even though they are hypothermic during that time, they have a body temperature that's maybe 8 or 10 degrees below normal. Their heart rate drops to about 8 to 10 beats a minute at most. And, a person, again, in that same situation wouldn't be able to heal a broken bone or a wound, but bears have the ability to do that. So they really are metabolic marvels in a lot of ways. And that's, they're able to overcome that challenge faced by hibernation. They're preparing for it right now. But there are far more conspicuous examples of hardship that they must overcome, especially when you take a look at bears and you see things like wounds and scars.
Yeah, injury is a significant challenge in it, and it's probably the one challenge that we see most often in front of the cams. And it's pretty disturbing to us because we see injuries that if it happened to us, we would be running to the doctor, trying to get help, It wouldn't heal on its own. But bears, again, when you talk about resilience, you think about how they recover from injury. And one instance, an example we had last year was 435's cub, Holly's cub, who was a spring cub last year and probably thought that playing with a porcupine was a good idea. Only the porcupine didn't think it was a good idea and released its quills, and that cub, its paw was filled with porcupine quills. So, and this happened in early September, and that cub was just a three-legged bear for the month of September. And it's amazing to watch. I mean, the adaptation too. Her mother, Holly, adapted to the situation too. They didn't walk quite as far or swim quite as far while that bear was healing. And it also would pull the quills from its paw, and biting that loosens and helps release those quills. So I'm being distracted by two subadults chasing each other. By the end of the month, when I left Brooks Camp, I saw her putting some weight on that. And now we see her just racing around, no evidence of any injury whatsoever. And look at her. I mean, well, that shows a couple things. Fearless, and her injury has healed. Mike, you have a couple of other examples about injury that we've seen, one of which is another of Holly's cubs.
Right. Holly has experienced a limping cub before, a hobbled cub. And I want to highlight number 89 Backpack, who I got to know actually as a fairly young bear in 2007. This is him as a yearling. During that summer, especially early in the summer, really he hobbled on three legs as a yearling. He was a fairly small yearling at the time. We don't know if he had a severe sprain or a broken limb, but obviously he wasn't, when he moved around, he wasn't placing weight on that front right leg. And I was working at Katmai as a ranger at the time, and I remember people, they were concerned about him, but also there was a couple of different takes that we heard most often. Some people said, well, you got to capture that bear, you got to put it in a zoo, you got to give it some treatment, it's not going to be able to survive in the wild. Other people thought, well, it's cruel to let that bear limp and experience pain, so you should euthanize it. And while, I kind of understand where people are coming from when they voiced those opinions, at the same time, it's important to consider that national parks not only preserve like the spectacles of nature, but also its harsh realities. And brown bears and Katmai experience those on a daily and yearly basis. But they also, I think, really deserve the chance to be wild bears. And, 89 being in Katmai National Park, a very large national park where, conflicts with people, for instance, are few, thankfully. But he was able to pull through that, with the help of his mom. He was well fed. And now he is a successful adult bear. We see him fishing at the falls and doing great. So he's recognizable. There's absolutely no evidence that he had a significant leg injury when he was just a yearling. And there's one other bear that I want to highlight, when we're talking about injuries, because it's just like such a prominent injury right now. You can see it very clearly on the webcams, and that happens to be the muzzle wound on number 32, Chunk. He is a really big adult male and comes back to Brooks River every year looking pretty pudgy, and he did so this year. He has a lot of body fat on him, but he also has a really significant wound across his muzzle, and it's deep too. Naomi, when you and I were looking at it, it did look like, it's I don't know if it hits the bone, but it's pretty darn deep. So I'm sure it causes him some discomfort and pain. It'll definitely give him a really prominent scar that'll last, into this fall, and it'll probably be recognizable next year. But that's kind of like a typical example of a lot of the wounds that these bears face, and they just have to pull through it. And they do. They have a remarkable ability to ignore pain as they experience it, a remarkable ability to heal in the face of, of these injuries that would put us in the hospital. And, given time, given their overall toughness, they recover from these injuries, they overcome it. And we've seen also examples, Naomi, that they can do the same with illness and even separation from mother.
Yeah. All of these instances that Michael is talking about are, tough for us to watch on the cams because we as humans, if we had the same experience, feel like we couldn't survive that. So we have to look at those bears as not humans. And one really poignant example of a bear being both sick and being separated from his mother is the bear that's now known as bear 6'3". And in 2019, this bear got very sick. And here you see it actually almost recovering, um, barely able to walk, she knew where she wanted to go. But this bear was left for dead by her mother, 505, and her sibling. And we actually thought the bear was dead too and went to retrieve it and found out, no, she was still alive. She was starting to recover. And part of resilience for bears is tenacity. And this is a great example of tenacity. Later in the season, this bear was scavenging scraps on the lower river with subadults. And here you see her in 2020, a fine, healthy bear. And not only is she healthy and fully recovered, but she reunited with her mother, 505, and her sibling. So we worry when we see things like this, but sometimes bears will really surprise us. And separation seems to us very, very difficult when we see a young bear, because normally they are with their mom for a whole other year. And Mike, you have another really good example of separation and survival.
Most mother bears in Katmai keep their cubs for 2 or 3 summers, and then they'll go into the den with their cubs for one more winter. And then the families typically separate in the springtime, right around May, early June sometimes, right when the mating season ramps up. But in 2015, there was a young bear that we saw, especially around the mouth of Brooks River. And this was like September, October 2015. And it was a very small bear. It really did look like it was a separated yearling. And now we know that this is the bear we call number 610. So this is a video that I apologize for the shaking because I'm in a kayak. It's a windy day, and I'm trying to video this young bear on the beach that looked to be like a yearling cub, a cub in its second year, but it's on its own. No mother's not around. We didn't see mother around it for weeks. So we don't know the circumstances that caused this bear to be separated from its mother, but it seemed pretty clear that it was a pretty small yearling. And because it was separated from its mother at an early age and at a time of the year where really they should still be hanging out with mom, again, it faced some difficult challenges in its life about finding a denning site, for instance, finding enough food, but it had those lessons that mother taught it previously, so it was able to perhaps remember some of those instances that instance where it went to the den the previous year with mom, or those lessons about scavenging for salmon, and it was also relying on its instincts to survive too. And at that time, it also had there's pictures from that year of 610 with kind of a significant wound and scar on her rump, and that is still fairly prominent today. So if we can bring that back, that first photo of her from this year, you can actually see a little bit of that. This isn't like the best photograph of her to show that rump scar, but it's there. So not only was she separated from her mother, but she also experienced probably a big wound early on in her life that she persevered through. So I think 610 is one of the stories that we probably don't talk enough about. You're going to see her visiting the falls and fishing downstream of there. She's not going to be right up at the falls. She's mostly just kind of looking for scavenging opportunities downstream. At least that's where I've seen her most often. But yeah, she's definitely one of those bears that was just kind of on her own at an early age, and you think, hey, is this bear going to make it? And she certainly did. In the wild, it throws so many things at bears, Naomi. But Brooks River, is also the most visited place by humans in Katmai National Park. So, how are bears like adapting and adjusting to the challenges that humanity may impose on the landscape?
Well, we throw a lot of challenges at them, and while you were talking, we were being rangers here. Ranger Cheryl was here helping me, and there were a couple people who got a little close to watching a bear, so we were dealing with that. But it's an extremely popular place to visit, and no wonder. But bears have made this place a great place for them to fish, get fat, and survive the winter. And they're willing to make what I might call sacrifices to do that. So they adapt, again, adapting to changing circumstances, or circumstances that they might not really prefer as part of that. The dominance in a hierarchy, so they don't fight throughout the season. The other one is a lot of people around. And you may have seen Bear 482 this year with her adorable spring cubs. And as you can imagine, she attracts quite a crowd. And I think we have a picture of her on the lower river with a lot of people watching her. Now, this is an adaptation, again, bears' resilience, where they're saying, okay, I've got a job to do. I've got to take care of these cubs. I've got to feed myself, feed these cubs. And I'm going to do my best to ignore all those two-legged animals that are up there clicking things around me. But it does have an effect on them. I mean, she's very much aware of all those people here. I saw her on the bank of the river, approaching the bridge, and she decided to change direction at that point. So bears are not only adaptive in the long term, but in the short term. They're constantly making decisions in the moment. Am I willing to take that risk? Am I going to do that? And that's a way they survive. And Mike, you had another example here of another bear that faces some of the same challenges.
We've been, looking for bear 132 this year quite a bit because she has some spring cubs. Earlier this year, and Naomi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure if she still has all three. She arrived with three. She may have, separated from one. We don't know the circumstances behind that. But 132 is
She
one of
only
those
has
bears
two.
that
She owns two.
Okay. Thank you for confirming that. She's one of those bears that sometimes seems to show a tolerance for people. She seems to be habituated to people, but sometimes when she has young cubs, we don't see her showing a lot of tolerance for the close proximity of people. So I've seen her most often not at the waterfall where you have a lot of people standing on the wildlife viewing platform, or not near the bridge where a lot of people walk back and forth and there's plane noise, vehicle noise, and things like that, but kind of in the middle. That last picture I took from the falls platform, looking way downstream, a few hundred yards downstream, in an area called the Cut Bank. So she's maybe just kind of looking for space in that area. Because when you're a mom with young cubs, it's tough because, if you go to Brooks Falls, you may be increasing the risk to your cubs. But if you're down at the mouth of the river, maybe you're not as tolerant of the presence of people there. So there's very limited space for you. But mother bears are able to adapt to changing fishing conditions, competition with other bears, the vulnerability of their cubs, and they got to adapt at Brooks River to the presence of people. And if you're a mother who doesn't have that ability, you can imagine that, or that tolerance for people, you can imagine that they're at quite a disadvantage compared to a bear who is habituated, like 482 or Holly or some of the others that we've mentioned. And this year, Naomi, not only are bears, experiencing a lot of people, but the rangers are as well. And I want to kind of bring in or ask you, what have the rangers been experiencing this year? Because I think it might be important to talk to folks who are thinking about visiting this year, what they can do to help reduce their impact on the bears while they're at Brooks River.
Yeah, I mean, we do want to think about safety when we're here, both for yourself and for the bears. This has been a different season for the bears because the salmon are 3 weeks late, and it's not a steady stream of sockeye like it has been in the last few years. There are pulses. So the bears are experiencing more competition with each other, and they're hungry. So they're kind of running around a little bit more. And we here this year, because of restrictions, COVID restrictions, we have fewer spaces to live and therefore fewer rangers here. So we're trying to manage this place in the safest way possible for our visitors and for the bears. And we're just asking that people recognize that and give bears space. I mean, I know you want to take pictures of bears when you come here. I want to take pictures of bears when I'm here. But 50 yards or more is really a reasonable distance. And if a bear is approaching you, please get out of its way. Bears have the right of way. We're visiting their home. And if we remember that, then it's safer for both of us. And at this time of year, you can't see what's around me, but it's a bunch of subadults who have found each other, and they kind of run around in gangs. So this time of year, you are absolutely going to run into bears along the road or the trail. And sometimes it's running subadults, and they don't care about you. They're just running and chasing after each other. So we have to be very alert and look around. And if we do that, it's an incredible experience every day.
And I think for me, it's also a lot about being proactive, not reactive to maybe what the bears are doing, thinking about how I can reduce my impact on the bears when I'm there. And in particular, I think one of the most important things that people can do, even though you might be crowded on the platforms, is just to stay on the platforms when you're watching bears, because bears can learn that that's a predictable place where people gather, and the bears can learn to kind of work around that. We see that working really well at Brooks Falls, because where the falls camera is located, there's usually 40 people standing behind there, all shoulder to shoulder. But there's a lot of bears at the waterfall, because that's like a predictable spot where bears have learned, hey, people are going to go there, but they're not going to be on the ground, competing with me for space. So when you're at the mouth of the river too, if you're visiting Brooks River, it's just really important to consider remaining on those wildlife viewing platforms as well, to help reduce your potential impact on the animals. Of course, Naomi, there's one more thing that bears and salmon in particular are going to deal with in now and in the future, and that's also something that's imposed upon them by humanity, and that's climate change. I think we can maybe look at some of our successful bears, or really successful bears that a lot of the webcam audience will identify as being successful, and maybe speculate about how climate change may impact bears like this in the future. Let's start with maybe our largest bear on the river, number 747.
Yeah, 747 is the prime example of a successful bear. He is our largest bear, was rewarded for that by your votes to make him the Fat Bear Week champion in 2020. And so he is very successful, and he came back fat this year. So he is a bear who could probably survive right now with not a lot of salmon, because he has those stores. But he also has a disadvantage. If for some reason there's warming in the Pacific, or warming here, and the fry don't, or eggs don't survive, and there's a year or 2 or 3 with fewer salmon, a bear of his size needs more salmon to survive, to support that bulk, whereas a smaller bear, a subadult, a younger bear, they can survive on grasses and berries. But a bear like this, right now, when there's a lot of salmon around, he's in good shape, and a real example of success. The other thing is that when we have experienced climate change here in 2019, it was we had a week of 90 degrees, and not only was 747 and any other bear not able to find any salmon because the salmon were hiding in a cooler spot, but imagine being 1,000 pounds and wearing a fur coat. Not very comfortable and very difficult to find a comfortable place and deal with all the other things that you have to deal with. So even a successful bear like that, we have such a healthy ecosystem here, but it could easily be damaged by climate change in so many ways. Mike, you want to talk about another bear that might show us an example of the effects of climate change?
Well, just one more bear, yeah, that I think is just a great example of an adaptable bear, and that's number 503, a young adult male, born in 2013. We see him at the river, fishing successfully in many different locations. He's tolerant of many bears, but he also seems to know where his boundaries are when faced with more dominant bears. And so he's an adaptable angler. The brown bears overall are adaptable omnivores. They can survive on a wide variety of foods, but the bear population in Katmai and across much of coastal Alaska is highly dependent on salmon. So while we might have bears able to survive on vegetation, for instance, climate change could disrupt the salmon run, and that's really what fuels Katmai's ecological productivity. That's why there are so many bears living in Katmai National Park. And due to climate change, the North Pacific and the fresh waters of the Alaska Peninsula, including the Katmai area, are certainly warmer than they were 60 years ago. However, they haven't gotten warm to a point where it's harming salmon habitat, not yet. That's not the case for other places in North America. And it may not be the case in the future for Katmai. In fact, if we do nothing, climate modeling and some pretty solid science suggests that much of the North Pacific will become uninhabitable for sockeye salmon in the summertime, and even perhaps during parts of the wintertime as well. So really, if we're thinking about the welfare of the bears, the well-being of the people in our communities, our neighbors, no matter where we happen to be around the world, the people in Bristol Bay who depend on the salmon for their livelihood and the tourism that the brown bears and fish bring to the area, young people, future generations, then it's really imperative that we act to mitigate climate change. We do not have any more time to waste. And right now, Katmai, Bristol Bay is a beacon of hope amongst all the sad environmental news that's going on right now. The largest salmon run on record in Bristol Bay happened this year. They just broke the record, I think, yesterday. So really kind of amazing things going on there in Bristol Bay right now. And I certainly don't want to end the broadcast, Naomi, on a down note, because the resilience of bears, the size of the salmon run in the Bristol Bay area right now really offers us many stories of hope.
Yes. I mean, we see examples of bears' ability to adapt and change and bounce back every day. And a bear's survival depends upon both physical and mental resilience. And it's hard not to worry when we see bears challenged by injury or illness or any other kinds of adversity. But to state the obvious, bears are not humans, and they have other mechanisms to cope and to thrive. And they're agile in adapting to a changing environment when their survival's at stake. So they're also tenacious in their daily efforts to survive and get through their biggest challenge, which is famine for half the year. So I think we have so much to admire and so much to learn from these bears, and I feel quite privileged to be able to watch them and learn from them every day. Mike, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yes, I think so. We can stick around for a few more minutes to answer a few of those
Sure.
viewer questions that came in. So thanks so much for everyone for questions, and we'll try to answer those in the comments directly after the broadcast. But a lot of people are interested in kind of like the topic that we've been discussing today, Naomi, and one person is wondering, and not just one person, but a lot of people. One person did ask about Otis. A lot of people have been wondering about him. One of the more prominent bears on Bear Cam since the beginning of Bear Cam back in 2012. He's an older bear in his mid-20s, at least he was last year. People are wondering, do we have any news about Otis. So I don't have any news. We haven't seen him yet. I don't know if there's been any development since the last time I talked to you, Naomi.
No, I haven't seen Otis. And again, I'm being distracted because Holly and her cub are right below me. Mike, this is really difficult. If only Otis would show up, then we would stop the broadcast and trumpets would blare. But no, we haven't seen Otis. Sorry.
Yeah, if Otis doesn't return, we're unlikely to know his true fate. Uh, it's always a little bit possible that an older bear like him could find another place to make a living. But Otis has come back to Brooks River every year of his adult life since 2001. So it's probably less likely that he's finding some other place to be, and maybe more likely that he is deceased. He left Brooks River last year looking like he was in good shape. I think we can certainly say that. I mean, there were so many salmon around.
Yes.
He looked pretty fat when we saw him last time. But food availability isn't the only thing that affects survival in brown bears. You can think of how many illnesses and ailments dogs suffer from, and other wild animals. Bears suffer from just as many, including things like cancer or viral infections. Certainly broken and worn down teeth, infected teeth, that impacts a lot of older bears. So, I mean, we don't know. And unfortunately, I wish I could give people, a solid answer. And if he doesn't return, allow people to reach some sort of closure. But unfortunately, we're probably not going to be able to do that with Otis. So he's one of those bears that we're looking for, and don't give up hope yet. I mean, he still definitely could return to the river this year. Speaking of,
it could be a long journey this year.
Yeah.
No, I just could be a long, difficult journey for him this year, and we just don't know.
And speaking of, kind of resilience after getting, kind of beat up in a fight, we saw 128 grazer beat up on a subadult that got too close a couple of days ago, and somebody's wondering, how is that bear? Have you seen that bear, Naomi? Right after it was released from grazer, it kind of shook things off and just went about its business. I didn't see anything that looked like a significant injury on it. So I suspect it's probably doing well, although maybe still hungry because it's just a smaller bear that didn't look like it had a lot of salmon meals in it. But I don't know if you have any news.
I don't have any news. I think I might have spotted it, but I can't be sure. I'm so bad at identifying subadults for sure. But I think you're right. I think that, again, we're talking about resilient bears. I think that bear is okay. Probably suffered trauma in a number of ways, also learned a big lesson. It's hard being a subadult. There are so many things to learn to survive. It's hard. So, but if we do have positive news, I will let you know. I haven't been able to show the video to Ranger Nick, who he's around bears up close and personal all the time, so could possibly get an ID from him and know if that bear has been around at all. So we're on the lookout.
And going back to bear families, how have our, mothers with spring cubs this year? I think there's at least 4 of them, adapted to meeting particular challenges this year. With with fewer salmon maybe moving through Brooks River than we've seen in the last few years, the ability for mother bears to make a living is harder. It's harder for them to make a living, I guess, to say it, just because most of the mother bears want to avoid Brooks Falls just because of the high concentration of bears there. Although there sometimes are females that will bring their spring cubs to the falls. So I think, overall they're doing fairly well. The salmon will only become more available to them and more accessible to them as the summer progresses, because early in summer, Brooks Falls and Brooks River is kind of where it's at. It's really the only place in the area, particularly in early July, where you're going to find salmon. But salmon right now are starting to spread throughout the watershed. So they're going to bears are going to be able to spread throughout and fish in different locations. So I think they're going to do pretty well, especially as the salmon start to spawn. Have you noticed any particular examples, Naomi, of a bear kind of adapting to the circumstances this year, one of those mothers with cubs?
Yeah, and one that I might cite is that because we've lost a lot of beach on Naknek Lake, so we sort of there's this long sloping shallow area, and there have been a number of salmon in that area. So we've had smaller bears and family groups catching fish along the beach on Naknek. So that's really interesting because normally it's a lot deeper there where the water is. I mean, the bears will, and especially the family groups, will walk the beach, but there's been fishing going on there. And also because we've had these big pulses of salmon and a lot of scraps and remnants and injured salmon, those fish are floating downriver. So I have seen the family groups get fish down there. And I must say, Bear 482 is quite a fisher bear, and I've seen her catch salmon down here in the lower river. So they're doing well.
And we'll try to get to just one more question. I know there's a few more in our queue that we're unable to have time to get to, but I appreciate everyone taking the time to submit those questions. Our last question for the chat today is about resiliency from fights. People see a lot of wounds on and scars on bears, and this person's just wondering about how resilient they are in the face of fights. When bears seem to get in fights, it doesn't seem like they dwell on it very long. From what I've seen, Naomi, a couple of years ago with 747 fighting number 68 in the jacuzzi right at the falls in July, two Titan bears getting into a real big brawl there. 747 walked away. He was bloodied. He lost that fight, but he came back to the waterfall not long afterwards and just started fishing again. And it seems like when bears get into fights like that, yeah, they're resilient in the sense that they just sort of get on with their life afterwards. Even if they happen to be injured. If the injury is severe enough, of course they're going to have to rest and let that heal a little bit, maybe before they can go back to active the normal activities. But otherwise, yeah, they just need to get on with daily life.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I've noticed about bears who've suffered injuries like that from fights or other injuries is they kind of learn their limits, and so dominant bears will not make purposeful dominant moves. They'll go to safer situations until they've recovered. I think it's just interesting to watch. I think we've seen that when 856 was injured a couple years ago, he pulled back. And so that's another way they can recover and be resilient, is to understand their limits, which I think a lot of us humans have trouble doing.
Well, it's been a fun conversation today, and I hope our audience enjoyed it as well. I certainly enjoyed speaking with Ranger Naomi Volk from Katmai National Park, my co-host today. My name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. We got more live events planned for the rest of the summer, so look forward to those with us, because I'm looking forward to presenting them and sharing this experience with everybody.